as well. So in terms of it being sort of an open session, we have got some slides that we've prepared, mainly from sort of some of the requests that came in via email as well. So we're going to try and focus on that. How does that sound for everyone?
Great. Sounds good to me.
That's good. Okay. So I'm not the only person from the exploitation team here today. We've got Rachel, who's our, well, do you want to explain who you are, Rich? And then.
Hi, yeah, I'm Rachel Albrook. I'm currently the Missing and Exploitation Coordinator, half of, so I'm supported by Amy Dancer as well. So there's two of us that cover the exploitation for the team.
Yeah, and Emma?
Hi everyone, I'm Emma Russell, so I work in the exploitation reduction team as well, but mainly focus on missing. So I'll do missing return home interviews after we've had a young person who's had a missing episode.
And Caris?
Hi everyone, I'm Caris Carradis, so I am within the exploitation team, but my focus is around violence and coordinator.
Cool, thank you. So we've got a good team here this afternoon too. And if I haven't said already, my name is Mike Collier. I'm a youth worker working with young people on one-to-one and also some group work with young people, especially young men is my main focus that are victims of criminal and sexual exploitation. Okay. Caris, are you okay? Are we recording? Yeah.
Yeah,
brilliant. Okay. So are people happy if we move on? Yeah. Cool. So the aim of the session, basically to understand the lay of the land in Walsall, especially around child criminal exploitation, although we will look at sexual exploitation as well within this session. It's really important that we share good practice when working with young people regarding exploitation. You know, what works, what doesn't work is crucial. Although we have a plan, we are open to discuss anything that comes up. One of the things that I feel is important is that there's no such thing as a stupid question. Please ask, and we'll do our best to answer. We're going to look a little bit at youth culture, but in particular youth culture surrounding young people that are victims of criminal exploitation. And we're also going to have a little bit of a look at how the pandemic has affected young people and the impact that that's had both nationally and within Walsall. So what I'd like us to do is either in chat or through conversation, if you're comfortable, let's have a look at some of these conversation starters or some potential hot potatoes that have been put out there. So, you know, child sexual exploitation only happens to young women. What are people's views or experience or comments or observations or reflections on that? If you want to either put anything in the chat or speak, then we're more than happy. So CSC only happens to young women.
I think in the wording, Mike, for me, obviously child sexual exploitation obviously refers to a child, but obviously we know that sexual exploitation does happen to adult females as well. Mainly the ones that we have dealings with within the hub are mainly the sex workers who are sort of forced out there on for prostitution by their pimps. So, you know, we've recently had dealings with a girl, an adult female that was involved with and coerced by a male who then took her off up to Middlesbrough who put her on the game up there. Obviously, we tried our best in terms of, so he got recalled, so we've got him out of the equation in terms of recall because he wasn't engaging with probation because he was offending. So he's in prison at the moment. But unfortunately, the adult female's not willing to talk to us in terms of giving us any information or statements of complaint regarding her being a victim of modern slavery that she's been forced to do, to sleep with men or that sort of thing. So we're stuck at the moment in terms of helping and supporting her. I think all the appropriate referrals have gone into adult social care, but she's just not willing to open up and engage at the moment.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So when we say child, what do people think the age is for a child, if you like? What are people's views?
I think it would go. You go under, you go your classic up to 18. But I think, if I'm honest, I think once a young person gets to the age of 15, 16, 17, I think people view them very differently. And this aspect of kind of choice and making a decision too, and getting themselves into situations and that type of language, you see a shift in language. And I think it becomes a little bit more, I think even though technically it's under 18, I would say that a shift in how the response can be in regards to sexual exploitation and decisions and choices can be a bit more victim blaming once they get to 15, 16. And I think they're seen very different. So I think they're not seen as so much as a child at that age. I think people, and I think that's where we can miss exploitation in CSE sometimes, because it's seen as, oh, this is just a young person making bad choices, opposed to this is a young person who has been groomed and gone through that pathway and has been influenced and coerced into doing things doing things that they don't necessarily want to do. So I think technically it's under 18, but I think there's a shift. I can see a clear shift, and I think it's harder for us to identify it once they get to 15, 16, 17, especially 17, because I think it's almost like, well, they're an adult soon, they can make their own choices, and it's almost like, well, they can make their own choices, but they're still an exploited, vulnerable young person within that.
And that's where we struggle, Caris, with consent, isn't it? So obviously, when consent's able to be given officially, that's when it's challenging then to prove the crime or to substantiate what is happening.
Yeah. It's the two golden ages, isn't it? 16 and 18 are the two ages where it's kind of like you said, those challenges come in, and it's almost like, well, what can professionals do at those ages?
And I suppose we've already kind of discussed, Paul, thank you for sharing about the case that you just mentioned. And we've kind of defined, I suppose, what we mean by child, because, language is important, and it's important to understand that. But I suppose the conversation starter is, does CSE only happen to young women? So if it was a yes or no answer, yes it does or no it doesn't, what would our answer be?
I'd say no, and only for a recent experience that we've all dealt with, Caris and Rachel and I and Sue, that we've dealt with a 16-year-old lad who was groomed by an adult male in his 50s, who gave him gifts and asked him to perform sexual acts on him. Luckily, thankfully, he didn't. That's going through a criminal investigation at the moment, where we've identified who the perpetrator is, and he's couldn't have been arrested and he's on police bail. So, no, answer to your question, it doesn't just happen to girls. Yeah,
and I suppose quite often when I talk to young people and adults that maybe don't work in our line of work, the reason why I ask that as a conversation starter is because quite often our thought process when it comes to CSC is young women or girls. And I think it's important that, and you made a good point there, Paul, that CSC happens to both male and female as well. So thank you for that. So a similar question. So child criminal exploitation, does it only happen to young men? Are young men only the victims of CCE? What's our experience around that?
I think with the young people that I work with, obviously the majority of children that have been criminally exploited are young boys, and with sexual exploitation it is young girls, the majority. But I think it's difficult, especially young boys, to disclose if they've been a victim of sexual exploitation because of the stigma. So if I try and have a conversation about sexual exploitation with a young boy, they're a lot more wary to kind of discuss that, whereas they'll more openly talk about criminal exploitation because I think that's what they see as more the norm. So I think maybe it's harder to get these disclosures from young boys who are being sexually exploited, which is why we see a difference in the comparison between girls and boys that have made disclosures. I think it is something that we need to normalise more when we're talking with young men and not family members of young men, that it is something that happens to boys as well. And the same, girls can be criminally exploited, more normalised. It's not a gender thing, it can happen to any young vulnerable person. Yeah. Something I try and normalise in my conversations anyway, but it is more difficult, I think, with young boys to talk about sexual exploitation. It's not something I would think would happen to them or that they'd really want to talk about as openly as they would criminal exploitation.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment? Thanks, Sue, by the way, for your comment in the chat. Sorry, I should keep an eye on that. If people want to comment in the chat, then feel free. But sorry, go on, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with what Emma's just said, because an education, like she's touching as well, is very important, because this young boy only came forward after he had a session within school on exploitation and grooming, that he actually went to his mentor and said, I think I am, or I have been groomed. And that's where it all came out. That we went out and spoke to the young boy with the assistance of social services, the social workers, who then gave us the information. So I think education plays a big part in it as well, especially within schools. Because when it comes down to the likes of myself and Emma going out to speak to the young person, it's very difficult. But if they have a bigger, broader conversation within an education setting, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, it helps as well to have conversations with our team, so people within our team, as to how exactly am I going to broach this conversation with a young man who maybe has been sexually exploited, or a young woman that is a victim of criminal exploitation. And I think sometimes the best way we can sort of work through these things is by having those conversations with people that we trust within our own teams as well. And that's kind of one of the reasons why these hot potato sessions, I feel, are quite important, because it means that we can talk about things that maybe we feel a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, or if we're not talking, then we can listen as well.
Do you feel that the Epstein case over in the States has helped? Because you've got the woman that was prosecuting Prince Andrew, and she was actually encouraging, I can think of other words, but I'll use encouraging other youngsters to follow the same route that she'd followed. So do you think that has brought it to the media, with the media, it's brought it to people's attention, so it opens more doors for you?
I think that's an interesting one, and we're going to cover sort of the role of media in a little while, but from a different aspect. So thanks for that, Jackie. That's a good question. I think the media have kind of played it one of two ways. I think, although the lady came forward and encouraged, kind of how the media played that was kind of almost like they put a black mark against the woman as well on the other hand. So they played it kind of both ways. They kind of said, yeah, it's okay to come forward, but then how they then focused on the case and how they portrayed it in the media maybe wasn't the right way of doing it. And I think quite often that's how it happens. You know, I read somewhere that there were some reporter somewhere said that it was about her getting sort of money from this and she consented, and you know, used words that were actually quite powerful for a victim of what she's been through. I think that's a little bit of strings and roundabouts for me. It's kind of highlighted it, but maybe in some ways stopped people from coming forward as well. I don't know what other people think.
Does that sort of media attention allows you to open the doors for other children or young adults, whatever the term is, because it's in everyday conversation.
Yeah.
It's not as if it's a closed conversation.
And go on. Sorry, Caris.
I was going to say, I think that's probably part of you sharing that so that we can adapt into practice, because I think it may be, if I'm honest with you, it's not something that I've thought of using in terms of, oh, have you thought about this? And like speaking to a young person openly about, I mean, I've done case history before and spoke to young people about that, but this particular case, I've never really thought to sit down, looked at it and thought of, oh, okay, well, this can be used as a resource really, or an opportunity to open up a conversation with a young person in a way that isn't necessarily so direct and so formal. So I think you've probably shared, for me anyway, you shared something that, oh, that can be something that can be used, I suppose. But I think in terms of its overall influence, I've got big issues with the media, if I'm honest, and the language that the media use, and how the different language that they use in terms of against like women and men, and how sometimes, you know, one person could do one thing and I think women are heavily demonized around stuff, and then sometimes it can be the completely opposite, where a woman does something and it's very sympathetic, even though if a man did it, it would be the complete opposite. So I think for me, in terms of the case being able to use to as a conversation starter to look at something and challenge the kind of normative thinking that we have, I think it's good for that. But I think in terms of the role of the media itself, my opinion of the media is that media tend to exploit information. That's my personal opinion. I feel that and I think for me, I'm always cautious around media for that fact, because I think sometimes it's got a spin on it, which I try to stay away from it at times, if I'm honest.
Yeah. What do you think, Jackie? What would your view be around using that, say, with young people?
I don't think it should be used as this is the solution, this is etc., etc., but a way of a young person to be able to sort of realise that there are conversations that are being had that aren't hidden anymore. It's a bit like wife battering. At one time, women just stayed really, really quiet, and then it became known that it wasn't just women, there was a percentage of males, and then it becomes in conversations that are not pushed under the carpet. That was all my thoughts saying on it.
I mean, go on, sorry, Rachel.
Oh, no, it's all right. I was just going to say, I think on the back of it, as in opening up the conversation for young people and allowing them to see that things are convicted and it isn't them that is to blame, that they are the victim. I think in that sense, it can be quite powerful. I do think that sometimes, like Caris has said, the media portrays things where it can put in a challenge. Our biggest challenge will always be with any child that has been exploited. Initially, they aren't going to see that they are being exploited. So that would be our first challenge, to obviously break down that for them to understand, like you said, actually, what is exploitation? How does it happen? What does it entail? Because the biggest thing for us, obviously, essentially, is making sure that the young person doesn't see that it is their fault. They haven't purposely ever put themselves in this situation. I think so it can open doors, but I think that's something that we always have to build up to, because it's not something a child will ever essentially, I think, watch first time and maybe say, yes, that's definitely what's happening to me. There's a lot of exploring that we have to do, and that Mike doesn't carry cinema, that breaks that down for us first. But I do think sometimes it can support opening conversations for us. Yeah.
No, I agree with that. And I suppose when we talk about, yeah.
Sorry, can I just say, just going on that about the media, I think with the media overall, it just sort of just always reports negatives, more or less like the positives. We have a couple of positives, but I find the majority is negative, you know, and the convictions, I think it's poorly recorded and known. That's my view.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think you know, sort of a challenge for all of us, maybe when we go away from here and carry on, is if we read any of the tabloid newspapers, maybe it's worth having a look at how young people are seen and how tabloid newspapers report on things like criminal and sexual exploitation, but not focusing on that, but let's focus on the positive of, let's find some good news stories about what young people have done in the UK, and maybe, you know, a challenge for us all is to share that with each other, because I think you're right, the few and far between. We're gonna move on. So when I sent out the email on Monday, I think someone responded back and sort of looked at and asked a question about gangs and young people and young girls and the influence around that. So what I want us to do is I want us to take maybe a little bit of a different look around gangs. So this is our starting point. And then from this, hopefully we're going to be able to have a conversation and answer some questions. So yet again, the word gang is quite an interesting word, quite a negative connotation. You know, quite often we hear and we read people say gangs of hoodlums or feral gangs of young people. So I want us to unpack sort of the word gang a little bit and see what we mean by this. So I've put two pictures on the side of this for a specific reason. Because they're both technically, in some ways, gangs. You know, you've got a gang of over 65s on your left-hand side, and I'm going to use a different word, a group of young men with hoods up and face covered on your right-hand side. But to kind of get an understanding of what we mean by gang, I did a little bit of a Google search. So this is my word. So the first bit, an organised group of criminals, hoodlums, or wrongdoers. Yeah, that's nice, isn't it? Or a particular social group, circle, clique, crowd, set, informal bunch. Or a group of people organised for a particular purpose. So when I did the Google search, these were the first three things that came up, and I thought that were quite interesting. So when we look at these two pictures, straight away, for me, who would you say, sort of prejudging whether criminals, hoodlums, or wrongdoers?
The ones on the right.
Instinctively, that's what we think. Yeah. What about anyone else? Anyone else dare say the one on the left?
No.
Yeah. What about informal or a particular social group, circle, clique, crowd, set, informal bunch, which are a group of people that are, no, we'll come out of that in a bit. So a particular social group, circle or clique, left or right?
Left. Oh, left.
We
Yeah.
could say both.
Yeah. And why would you say that, Caris?
Because it just looks like both look like informal groups.
Yeah.
So that's literally it. It's nothing profound. I just think they both just look like an informal group. So I would probably, yeah. I mean, yeah. But I was going to say potentially maybe I wouldn't say the left, but do they look informal or not? I wasn't sure. I was trying to look at their outfits, but yeah, I think the they just look like casual groups all together. So
Yeah.
I'll put them both on each side, and I think
Yeah,
that could quite easily be a group that could easily just be like a group of kids like on the music session, really, couldn't it?
yeah,
So yeah, I'd say either of the two.
yeah. Oh, we've got our hand up. Sorry.
Sharon.
Yeah, hi Sharon. Do you want to say something?
Sorry, I
It's
think
okay.
with regards to those two photographs, and what do you mean by gang?
Yeah.
I think it's purely one of, it is an ageism. As the older you are, and I'm 60, I would look at a group of young youths, mainly boys, in the right-hand picture, and I would instantly think gang and trouble.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think of friends just hanging out. The group on the left, and my eyesight's not particularly bad, so I can't see that picture pretty brilliantly, but it looks like an older group of men and women.
Yeah.
And I would think that as a social group rather than a gang of friends.
Mm-hmm.
And that's coming from an ageist. Sorry, I am admitting I'm 60, and knowing where I live, I see that issue that we have on our estate with groups of young men in a gang, and it's scary.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And I think what, clothing is a powerful thing. So on the left, they're wearing quite bright colours, which is quite warm, quite drawing you to them. The group on the right, face covered, hats on, sort of the body language is sort of one of kind of thing. They look quite boisterous. I think maybe one or two are smiling, but is that a smile or a grimace? I don't know. And so we judge quite often, don't we? I can't comment on the group on the left because that is yet again just a Google image, but I can comment on the group on the right. So the group on the right are a group of young people that probably about 5 or 6 years ago accessed the Lighthouse Youth Centre in Birmingham. The group that were, as Caris has already said, you sort of took my thunder, involved in a music project. All, I think, of these young people talking to the youth worker who manages the centre have gone on to do some form of work in music. Either gone to university to study or are producing or doing other things. And yet, so these are what you'd class as maybe grade A students who love what they do. Sorry, Paul, you've got is that Paul? You got your hand up?
Yeah, Mark, you carry on now. I'll come in at the end.
Okay. And it's interesting, isn't it, how we sort of stereotype young people. The fact that out of the 6 or 7 in that group, most of them are now working or at university is pretty impressive. But we don't know that unless we know the background story to it and have those conversations with those young people. So they are probably more than the group on the left, because as I said before, it's just a Google image, a group of young people who are organised for a particular purpose, and that particular purpose was a love of music that brought them together. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah. So my question probably is more to you, Mike, because obviously you work a lot with young people. Some recently, when we've looked at some gangs issues within the town centre, and you speak to, myself and Sue have spoken to a couple of the lads, and they refer to themselves as a gang. What is your take on when they come to you and you're speaking to them and they say to you that they are a part of a gang? Do you question, try and educate why they call them a gang and what is their spin on it?
So my starting point with any young person is why do you use the word gang? What's your image of a gang? You know, because it could be anything from kind of a Peaky Blinder kind of experience, you know, where you're on the rob and you're taking over land, or it could be just that you're a group of young people that have got a common thing that brings them together. Or it could be that they're a group of young people that, let's face it, are involved maybe in low-level antisocial behaviour, that are getting a little bit of a reputation because of what they do and where they go. And maybe they have got issues with other areas as well. So to kind of bring that identity to themselves, they call themselves what did we hear on Monday? Not so much a gang, but they use the word block or side or crew. So those are sort of some of the languages that young people we're working with at the moment are sort of using, which will basically describe themselves as a gang. So
I think sometimes it is to project fear to other groups, gangs, cohorts, whatever. If they call them a gang, then they're more of a threat.
Yeah,
that's my opinion. That's why they often call themselves a gang.
Yeah,
and there's a sense of identity in there as well.
Yeah.
Isn't there? I think that when you see, I think that they come together for a common purpose, and sometimes that purpose may not be great, but I think the sense of loyalty, the sense of someone having you back, the sense of having somebody to turn to, having the sense of someone's going to be there for you no matter what. Because when we look at young people who are gang affiliated, when we look at them, I think they could go across, depending on what's going on that day, they could fall into any three of those groups. So you could have a group that's involved with criminality, but on a Tuesday they've just gone to the park or they've just done this, and then, or do you know what, guys, let's all meet up together and just like chill out at so and so's house. And at that very point in time, they're not doing anything antisocial. They're not doing. But when it comes to the criminality side and when that crosses over, I think it's difficult, because then it's almost like, even when we're looking at the images, if I'm honest with myself, if I've only worked with young people who are on the verge of criminality, all involved in criminality for the last how many years, and I would say a lot of them would be dressed in a tracksuit. Do you know what I mean? They might be dressed in, they might have designer stuff on, etc., etc. So I think media, and what you see so often is you see that in front of your face all the time. So even as a practitioner, it can be easy to kind of look at a young person dressed in a certain way and be like, oh, they remind me of this kid that I've worked with, or that kid, or this kid, or that kid. But then I think equally through other work that I've done, or even in my own family or friendships and all the rest of it, it's knowing the difference between what is youth culture and what is gang culture. And to be honest, like when we think about it on a practical level, like I'm a teenage girl or a teenage boy, why do I want to walk around in like jeans? Like it's just so much more comfortable to just sit down in a trackie and a jumper. It's not because I'm trying to portray myself to be something that I'm not. It's just, this is what we wear as young people. This is comfortable. This is something but whereas, because what we see also kind of falls in line with the young people that are involved in crime, etc. I think it's something that we've got to be mindful of, in terms of, okay, fair enough, you've seen 10 people like this, or you've seen 15 people in a group like this, but yes, they could be involved in criminality, but at the same time they also could just be hanging out with each other. I mean, personally, yesterday I went into one of the things that I find strange is one of the new fashion statements is a balaclava. I find it really strange. Because I'm just like, it just looks weird to me, for me. But I went into a shop yesterday and there was 3 young people in a group with each other, and they all had balaclavas on. And I walked in at first and was kind of like, have I walked into the middle of a robbery scene? Like, because they all had balaclavas on. But then I stopped for a second and I double took because they had balaclavas on, and like looked at them, gave them a smile, and they were just on their merry day, and like, couldn't see that they smiled back because they had the balaclava on, but they were friendly, just walking around looking for something in the shop. And I think there's certain things that now are just common, and things that they will, like, young people will just wear, but for someone else on the other side that doesn't understand that can be intimidating and threatening. But also understanding that some young people will wear balaclavas because they're going to be up to something that they don't want their face to be seen around. So I think it's just having that open mindset and not having that one track thinking and just automatically assuming you look like this or you are this. But I do understand where it comes from.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keris. Sharon, your hand's up. Is that a legacy hand or is it?
No, that's a real thing.
Oh, that's cool.
I was really interested to hear Keris talking about the balaclava, because balaclava's gone through one heck of a history, and I love clothing history. From the time in the 30s, 40s and 50s when balaclavas, all kids, all boys, were given balaclavas to wear. Boys, I'm talking school age boys, were given balaclavas to wear because it was warm, and in those days no houses were centrally heated like they are now, so it was a warm thing to wear. By the 60s, the balaclava had progressed from, even my brother was still wearing a balaclava as a kid then, but in the 60s it then started to become used as an item to hide the face. So it was then used in criminality, and that continued right up till today, when it's switched again. You've still got it used for criminality, but it is now still being used for fashion again, but by older men rather than young kids. So it's a fascinating piece of history that goes along with the gang thing.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and it were interesting, Paul. I'm sure you know. Last year there were quite a disruption, a fight in the town centre, and just before it kicked off, what was interesting was the young people that were gonna fight got to the area and you could see the face. As soon as it kicked off, the masked up, the bellied up, and they were there doing it, and it was quite comical in some ways that they actually physically put it over the faces to almost commit a crime, but beforehand you knew exactly who the young people were, and I suppose it's that kind of nuance sort of thing now.
Fashion statement and criminality rolled into one.
yeah, pretty much.
And there's the saying, isn't there, Mike? No face, no case.
That's it.
That's commonly was said by they'll say no face, no case.
Yeah.
And obviously they didn't think about that before then, though, Mike, when they were on easy.
Not at all. when they were all sort of talking and dancing and stuff, yeah, they were fine. But I suppose that the question is, having had this conversation now, are there gangs in Walsall? What do people think?
Can I jump in and say yes, definitely there are gangs in Walsall.
Yeah.
And you see that there are gangs. There's a gang on the Beechdale estate, and there's another gang on the Reedswood, and there is without doubt evidence where the two groups do not like each other, and they have barriers to warn each other off. It's very distinctive.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So the question is, are they gangs as in the first statement, as in a group of criminals, hoodlums or wrongdoers, or are they a gang as in a group of friends that maybe, as Keris said, Tuesday they go to the youth centre, Wednesday they commit low-level antisocial behaviour, Thursday they're in a fight with Reedswood. How would you sort of define that gang?
From what I've seen on Beechdale, it's a strange mix, because this group of boys do tend to hang out together socially. They are a group of so-called friends, but they're definitely also a group of wrongdoers. I'm not going to say criminals, I'm going to say wrongdoers, because there's definitely occasionally hoodlum experience with them on the estate.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think a conversation that we're having as a team, in fact, we had it yesterday, that's how I can remember it, because my memory isn't that good usually, is, is it kind of, is the issue with the locality, as in a group of young people that feel safe within their community, or is it a contextual issue where young people maybe have friends in community, but then maybe go to school in another area, so their issues then are in that area, or their issues are sort of, like we say, family related, or issues with maybe around race and racism. There's a lot of things that we have to take into account when we're working with young people, especially young people that say are from sort of the Birchells, Reeswood Park area, and young people from sort of Beechdale area. And it's important to understand the context of that, and also, like Sharon and the clothing, sort of the historical context to some of these issues as well, because they just haven't appeared overnight. The things that maybe have been brewing and taking place over generations. So yeah. So what do other people think?
And can I just say, and I'm sure Caris will touch upon this as well. From I'm sure Caris, you have seen this more than me, because obviously you do with more the youth violence side. That we, as a police force, don't necessarily too quick to label people as gangs, because there's a proper process for calling a gang or an organized criminal group. There's things that we have to see before it gets properly officially labeled as a gang, and I'm sure, like I said, Carrie, you know more about that than I do in your piece.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like, we kind of use the word gang as, I think professionals use the word gang, but we don't necessarily understand that police can't use the term gang, and it's quite efficient in terms of getting into that first. It will be that first section of an organised group of criminals. But at the same time, I mean, I'm as looking at it, I mean, technically, by looking at that, Mike, I mean, you've got a gang that we run every Monday.
Yeah, we have.
myself and Mike do an anti-violence group, and we've got a group of young people who come together with us, and the whole purpose of that is to figure out an anti-violence strategy in Walsall. So, when you look at it technically, but I think when we're looking at gangs, like you're saying, Paul, I think we've got a lot in Walsall. I think we've got distinct different gangs in Walsall. I don't think that they are one. We couldn't say, oh well, Walsall has this or Walsall has that. I think we can see it differs from area to area, like you were saying, Mike. I think there's familiar context to it at times. Also, the age bracket changes. So you may have older organised crime groups. You may have which maybe police would recognise. However, in terms of gangs, official police saying this is a gang, there's not many in Warsaw, and only one springs to mind that police would label gang. However, when I'm looking at community and what we get from the young people on the ground, there's quite a few that are running, and a lot of it seems to be, not all of it, but a lot of it seems to be area based, I would say, in terms of its specific areas against other specific areas. However, like Mike says, that can also bring into a context of what school you go to, because how does that work when you go to the school with this side and you've got that side? So you may have two different areas, distinct groups, but go to the same school. So then you've then got to look at the impact that it has on not just community but education as well. And I think we're seeing that more and more, aren't we? Across, just as a team, we're seeing a lot of the violence that stems through. I want to say gang culture very loosely, but more a group of young people who have identified themselves as a group and are functioning and operating as that first top, we would say potentially a gang. But I think there's so much behind underneath it. So that's why I use the term loosely, because they're not always in that space of causing crime, etc. But I think a lot of the crime that we see is normally a response, opposed to I'm just out here to just cause trouble. It's for me personally, adolescence with an inability to resolve conflict outside of a violent manner, and having a group of common-minded people who also don't have that within them just yet. So it just takes conflict, which is going to happen regardless of whoever you're going to have conflict, and then the violence is a response, and then that kind of piggybacks off each other, and we see an escalation, which is what I think we're seeing also at the minute. It's quite, and I think it's escalating quickly. Would you say? I don't know. I think it's escalating quite quickly. So I get when you were saying, I think it was Sharon who was saying that it can be scary, because at the same time when you see certain things, there's a sense of fear, but there's also majority of young people in Walsall who aren't gang affiliated and who are doing their everyday. Majority of young people aren't involved with what we're seeing, and I think because we hear about the bad, like Mark was saying, we don't hear about the positive sometimes, we hear about the negative so much, we can be flooded with the negative, but forgetting that majority of those in community are actually getting on with it and doing what they need to do.
And I think, you know, what we're saying is right. We talk about gangs, but then I look at some of the young people that I work with that would say they're in a gang or part of a group, and they're also victims of exploitation, although they may be perpetrators of crime as well. And I remember having a conversation a number of years ago with a young man in McDonald's doing his return home conversation. And he'd sit and he'd talk to me about where he'd been and what he'd done. And all of a sudden, his mobile phone rang. And he goes, mid-conversation, Mike, I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm like, okay. And he picks his phone up and answers it. And the conversation went something like this. What do you mean you've lost it? Where are you now? Look, I'm going to have to come over and sort you out. And he hung up and he's like, mate, I've got 2 minutes and then I'm going to have to sort my employer out. And literally, he had his food, drank his drink, we finished the conversation, he got up and he walked out. And what was interesting about that young person was he saw what he was doing as a job. So he had young people under him that were working for him, but he was equally being exploited as the people that were under him. It's just that he'd moved up the level or up the ladder, that it was hard to see where or how it was being exploited. And I think with criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation, perpetrators have the ability to get into young people's minds and praise them and big them up on the one hand, and then knock them down so far on the other hand that emotionally they're scarred. And so it isn't just the violence within criminal exploitation that I feel we have to deal with. It's almost like that unscrambling of a mindset, because it's almost like they've been hypnotized into doing this work through physical and mental, violence. And so for me, that's an interesting one. So when I work with young people that claim to be part of gangs, and we're going to move on to this in a bit, it's important to understand that they've gone through a process of being exploited as well. And sometimes that's really hard to see and to understand, and as professionals to get our head in a decent place to work with young people. Are we okay to move on, or shall we? Yeah, cool. I'll do that. I got the nod of Rachel, so I will. So this might be pretty basic, but there's a reason why we're doing this. So I just wanted to go through a couple of terms that people use. So it's quite self-explanatory. I'll read it out anyway. So cuckooing, and every time I read this, I am honestly shocked that people do this. But it's where groups target or take over a home. It's usually vulnerable people. So, and not just people with mental health. It's happened to single parent, bringing up children, as well as sort of targeting vulnerable people with mental health issues. And they use it as a base for where young people can come and pick up gear and either do county line or drug trafficking. And obviously the name cuckoo comes from sort of where a bird takes over and lays an egg in a nest that isn't the bird's egg, and then it hatches, and yeah. So that's that's cuckooing. It's happening. These aren't just things that we talk about. You know, I've worked with young people where they've answered the phone and they basically said, we're in this house, this is what we're doing it for. Come straight after you've met with whoever you're meeting with. So these happen. Trap house, similar, a house where people go to buy drugs. Yeah, usually rented by the main person or a group of people who are involved in business of illegal drugs. These aren't my words. I've actually got this from, yet again, Google, but the police website as well. So the person running the house handles the sales, and they also maintain surveillance to see if the police are coming for a raid. What's interesting about trap houses and cuckooing is that social media plays an important part in this too. So people will place things on Instagram or Snapchat to say, you know, this is where we are, this is what we've got. We'll be here for 10, 15 minutes or for a couple of days, come and get what you need. So it's more than just word of mouth. People are using social media for this as well, which yet again is of concern. Any comments or observations or reflections on that before we move forward?
For when it talks about county lines drug trafficking, obviously we know county lines is usually drugs that's moved from county to county or across the country, but we see more in Walsall for vulnerable people like you just said, Mike, who've got mental health, who are being targeted by local drug dealers. So they're not part of the county lines. They just want to operate from a base that often they pimp out the sex workers, and that they want to take over that property. And usually it's in the vicinity of Wednesbury Road, which has happened quite often to a number of vulnerable adults along that section in the heritage as well, because it's a great location for them to use it as a base and go back to use it for the girls to have sex with their customers. So it is quite rife. We've seen it a couple of times of recent months with cuckooing. One that we worked with quite closely recently, where she was asked. She was asked. She was asked that they wanted to take over her property, but luckily she was strong enough to say, "No, you're not." Unfortunately, she got assaulted in the process. But it is a real risk to a lot of these vulnerable people, because I know of one occasion where they took over a man's property on Wednesbury Road, and they injected him of drugs to get him hooked on to drugs to enable them to stay there, which he didn't speak up, didn't tell anybody. It wasn't until neighbours started complaining of the antisocial behaviour and the crime and stuff next door that myself and Accord Housing at the time went along and spoke to him, and obviously we helped support him and did the necessary and closed the property down. But it is more common than you think.
Yeah, and so I suppose from that, Paul, what would you say? Because you know we may be professionals that work in community. What would you say are the signs that we need to look out for in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, usually the neighbours themselves usually report the antisocial behaviour, or it could be that the people that they're working with are saying that people are coming, they can't get them out of the flat. They're not obviously usually going to use the term cuckooing, or they're trying to force me out, because sometimes they do force them out, sometimes they don't. They just keep them there, but use it as a base. They force them onto the sofa and they take over their bedrooms and things like that. But it usually comes down to them saying that they're being you know, I've got friends coming. Oh, they're just friends. They're okay. I'm happy for them to be here. But as you look round, especially when you do your unannounced visits, is like the drug paraphernalia, and obviously the person they're working with often is sort of uncleaned, unshaven, unwashed, and things like that. They are sort of neglecting themselves, and like I say, sometimes that they could be taking the drugs themselves because they've started to inject them.
Yeah. Alice, I think you had your hand up. Have you got a question you'd like to ask?
No, it was just literally to add a bit on. To be honest with you, it was covered sort of then just when Paul said I'm a learning disability nurse. So I work in the community, so there's lots of sort of stories. I've not experienced it, thankfully, myself, but where there's just really quite significant behavioural changes, lack of engagement where maybe before there was an engagement, and obviously that befriending vulnerability and potentially a lack of boundaries and things. I think if you develop a relationship with someone, you can kind of pick up on those telltale signs, which is, you know, it's very sad for the person, obviously, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then again, I've heard before of sort of going to premises and seeing differences in the people that are there, or the attitudes towards professionals from people that are there, or people trying to avoid certain times if people know from 9 to 5 that there's more likely to be professionals coming, you know, things like that, avoidant techniques and so on. But yeah,
and I think it's important to understand both sides of this story. So a number of years ago, I worked with a young man who had been missing for a number of weeks. And when he came back, I met him and we were having a conversation. And the conversation started with, yeah, but Mike, I got like $2,500 and I got myself some new trainers and a new trackie and all this sort of stuff. And I let him talk and I asked questions. And obviously, he was really glad about what he'd got. And then I didn't ask for an address, but I asked him where he stayed. And what had happened in regard to cuckooing was the people that were exploiting this young person had taken over a home of a man who was a heroin addict. And when he was not using, he was fine. People could talk to him. He'd have a conversation. People knew he was a heroin addict in the local community. But when he started injecting, in that stage of sort of cold turkey, he'd get extremely violent to whoever was around. And so where this young person stayed in this flat, he had the bedroom, and the bedroom, he said, had probably 2 or 3 locks on the door, because when this man would come in off drugs, he would show his violence towards the young person in the house. So what he were sharing was this experience of living the dream, having money in his pocket, having beautiful clothes, but his reality was he was sharing a house with someone who were quite volatile, who were very vulnerable himself, and this young person was actually at risk being there, but the young person didn't see it as that. He saw it as a way of earning money, a way of providing for his mum, a way of, you know, looking good, etc., etc. And I think, you know, young people put themselves in, no, young people are forced to be in very dangerous situations like that young person, but they don't see it often. And that's something that I pick up on quite a lot when I talk to young people.
Yeah, and often that they take their drug users themselves, so they get their drugs free. So they don't want them to go because they're getting drugs free on a daily basis for them. So obviously they have to work for it as well. They probably have to go out and run some drugs here, there, but ultimately they'll come back and they'll have that open tap of drugs for them as well.
Yeah.
So they don't see themselves as victims.
I suppose as well, when you're talking about signs as well, one of the things, it would be a lot of foot traffic, I suppose. The foot traffic of, if you're seeing a lot of foot traffic to somebody's home, vulnerable adults, vulnerable young people, just going in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, for me, that would be a massive warning sign if you're aware of like a vulnerability, especially I think I would say mental health and drug dependent adults. That those two in particular, I think if you know that and you can see heavy foot traffic or just an instant kind of increase, and then all of a sudden you're seeing, you know, a whole load of, you know, a different group of people who are there in and out, and then after that you're seeing an escalation of kind of visitors. For me, that would be like a massive warning sign. But I think you've got Kukurian and Trap House here, but I think it's so diverse, isn't it? I think in terms of the actual perpetrators, they diversify so much. So even when we look at Kukurian in a Trap House, like, I think young people won't necessarily use that term. They wouldn't use the term Kukurian, they wouldn't use the term county lines. They're more likely to say, oh, I'm going to the bando, or they'd say, you know, and even within that, when they go into these places, is that it can also become a bit of a social circle as well. So when we're looking at these kind of trap houses as well, so you might have a group of young people who have got nowhere to go, they've got nothing to kind of do on that day, and they know where the local kind of trap house is, and they'll just go there, hang out, chill, maybe smoke a spliff, and then they'll leave. Being surrounded by drug users, being surrounded by all these risks and all these dangers, but it can also become kind of a frequent spot where people can just go and chill. And I think for me, I then ask the question, why does this group feel like they've got nowhere else to kind of go, that they've gone to a place where there's clear risk, there's clear danger, but can feel settled and can feel, okay, well, we could just chill here, and understanding that, you know, a trap house doesn't always look like a dingy place. It doesn't always look like a place that nobody would see. Then I think perpetrators and exploiters are cottoning on to the fact that the more comfortable they can make it, and they can make these young people feel like they're, you know, doing a job, and earning, the more sophisticated that process is, the longevity you have of that young person. Potentially you can start working with you. So what you can see as well, Airbnbs are used as well. So you can have decent Airbnbs that, you know, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, okay, well, this is happening here. They'll rent out an Airbnb for a week and potentially use that. If they don't want to cause too much suspicion in the house, they might not necessarily have people come into the house, but they may store the house, and then you may see the person going in and out of that property. But that's just where the drugs are held. But also understanding that that young person is accountable for those drugs. That young person is accountable for all of that in that house. So, for example, when Mike has just said, you know, you've got a heroin user, you've likely got a young person who is involved in selling that heroin. The reason why you would assume, I would think that the reason why those locks that are on the door is to protect the person that's inside because he's getting vulnerable. But I would beg to differ. I would say it's more likely that the locks on the door are there to protect the stash and to protect the drugs, so that this person is kept in line and they don't have a helping hand to whatever's there. And it just goes to the kind of way of thinking of the exploiters and the perpetrators, that these young people are commodities, but they wouldn't necessarily see themselves as that. And I think they actively work to make sure young people don't see this. So when we see, you know, a trap house, and it's even like now desensitized through music, etc. Like, it's just an everyday thing. We could, you know, we go in and out. I'm working, I'm making money, and that's what's kind of portrayed. So I think there's an element of this that can be glamorized as well, and it doesn't necessarily, how we discuss it isn't how they discuss it, I would say.
Yeah. So I'm moving on, Rachel. I don't need. Here you've got 3 photos of a trap house. Oh no, sorry, you haven't. Sorry, I tell you, I'm totally wrong there. I apologise. What these 3 photos are is an advertisement that Puma and JD Sports did in 2016 to advertise their new clothing and trainer brand. And what Puma and JD Sports did was they sent out, so these were actual posters that you saw around and about. So on the first picture, you've got a phone, you've got a train ticket or a rail ticket, and you've got some stuff that are advertising Puma, but they're like £50 notes, but it's got the Puma logo on. The second one is yet again, it's a staged photo, so this isn't real, of some graffiti And the idea of this was that people, mainly young people, would read the different types of graffiti, and what you'd do is you'd make a link of where the next place would be. And so what JD Sports did, yet again in partnership with Puma, was they created an on-set trap house where young people and adults could come and look at the clothing brand that they've got. So we talk about the use of media and how it infiltrates. Here is Puma using something that they would call urban youth culture, but actually something that, as we've already discussed, is something very dangerous, and using it to attract young people to their brand. And when I first heard about this, I thought it was an April Fool's joke. I really did. So what happened was there were 7 or 8 of these different posters, and each poster would have a bit of a clue or a bit of a number, and young people could get on sort of the special guest list by working out the number. They'd send a text to that number and they'd get a code back to go to the official launch. And for me, that goes beyond words. But this is kind of how, when we talk about media, they're using things that young people are maybe into or like to get their branding used. So we've kind of gone from the seriousness of trap houses within Walsall and across the country to actually now how big conglomerates are using these to influence young people. So any thoughts or comments around that?
Just on the back of what you were saying, Mike, about social media and how big an impact it has. I mean, we all know children of Snapchat, Instagram, everything else that they can get their hands on online, and the huge impact that the criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation that has on children. It is very glamorized. You see all these kids driving around in what look like amazing cars, and they're potentially 14, 15. Peers want to get in on that. They want to join in and want to understand. It's not sold as a criminal lifestyle a lot of the time, like you've just said to these young people. They're potentially young people who haven't grown up with the best upbringing. They haven't had the newest of everything they've wanted. They're struggling in school. They want that attraction. They want the attention of other people. And all of a sudden, it's sold to them. The dream is sold over Snapchat. And we've looked previously, fraud, children being told that they can have money paid into their account. Yeah. Easily sorted. They're left with 300 quid in 10 minutes. Easy money making. They pass it round to their friends. And then they're all ending up in this glamorized lifestyle, like you've just said, that them bigger brands are actually using to manipulate people, essentially. So it is a massive challenge online.
Yeah, no, you're right, Rachel. It really is. So Puma did get into trouble for this. It did cause a lot of controversy. I think they lost money because of how they advertised it. But just the fact that they were able to advertise it like this, and young people in particular were aware of this, just shows sort of the glamorization of something that, as we've already talked about, is very, very serious. On a lighter note, Caris, I think this is you. We're going to talk very, very quickly about the team in Walsall and who we are, what we do, how we do it, etc.
Well, I'm still like reeling off that, to be honest. I'm just so really angry. Like, who does that? So I'm still reeling off the last slide, Mike, but I'll pull myself together. So we've got the hub, and actually, to be honest, we're in a good position at the minute because we've got quite a few hub partners on the call. So we've got the Exploitation hub. So this is the hub which is made up of different partners. So you have got us in the team here, but Amy, who is part of the exploitation reduction team within the council. You'll also have street teams. You will also have the police. We've got a couple of the police here today. We've got Paul, who's part of the hub, and we've got Sue. You'll also also have a coordinator from the police exploitation team as well. We have somebody from the adult social care team. We also have somebody from missing someone education. And we also, and I think that is
Locate.
someone.
Youth justice.
Yes, we have youth justice, and we also have locate, which is the missing aspect of the police. So what I'll do is I'll explain kind of the triage process, etc. But in terms of people's roles, just because you're here, it would make sense that I just go over to the people who are in the team. So we've got Exploitation Hub, so that's the partners. The whole idea is that we work together to identify and reduce exploitation across Walsall. So the hub mainly functions through the triage process. Obviously, we've all got our individual roles and things we do outside of that, but it functions through the triage process. So I'm not sure how many partners we have in terms of Walsall-based partners within the council, but what we have is a referral mechanism into the triage. So you'll have an exploitation assessment. So anybody can complete this assessment. This can be school, anybody who have got concerns around a particular young person that's been exploited. Now that's available on the council website. What we'll cover on that form will be the personal details for the young person, what type of exploitation, where it is, any locations. We'll also any vulnerabilities for that young person. It will also explore the full context around that young person. Now, the whole idea and the whole reason, and then we'll also ask you for a risk level. So the risk level on there will be low, medium, or high. So if you're looking at a low risk young person, this is a person who is vulnerable to exploitation. This is the one that I think we probably have quite a large. Rachel's smiling because she knows what I'm going to say. We have a large kind of cohort of young people, but it's also the most misunderstood category as well, I think, because when we're saying that a young person is low risk, what we are saying is that this person could have high level of vulnerability. We can see that this person potentially could be targeted. We're seeing that kind of vulnerability there, but it's not evidence. So bringing on to medium is that we've got evidence that this person's been targeted for the purposes of exploitation. So again, it's specific in the sense of, yes, this young person is being targeted, but it's for the purpose of exploitation. So for an example of that would be a young person who has been contacted by an individual with where there's an imbalance of power. I was thinking if we can recognise that imbalance of power and has been coerced in some way, shape or form to, for example, CE, selling drugs, or for a young person involved in CSE to exchange a sexual act. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Nothing's happened, but they've been targeted for that purpose. Maybe they're still in the grooming process, and that's where we're kind of looking at them. We're looking at them going down there. Now, high risk would be that person has been vulnerable, groomed, targeted, and is now actually being actively exploited. So for C, that may look like a young person who is now selling drugs for the person who's exploited them, or it may be for CSE, a young person who's unfortunately now being taken to certain locations and forced to have sex with multiple different people, just in a broad aspect. So what will happen following that? And the reason why the form, when people look at the assessment, they'll be like, oh, this is so long. But there's a purpose behind why the form is the way that it is. So it's very specific around locations, people of concern, the victim's voice, anyone that can kind of be around there. And the purpose around that kind of context that we ask for in that form is for the purpose of disrupting and targeting. What we don't want to do is just sit down and have a conversation about a young person. We want to be able to disrupt it. So if we've got a location, if we've got people, we can work together collectively. It's normally be police led in terms of disrupting that activity. So if we've got a place, so for example, I can see on someone's put in the chat that there's potential location for a trap house, etc. Now, say for example that was on a form connected to a young person, Paul could pick that up, or Paul's team can pick that up on a policing perspective, and action can be taken to either monitor the situation or to shut that down. I'm going to let Paul go into that because I feel like Paul's better at saying this. However, it's important to say that sometimes we will get a form where we don't have that evidence of locations and particular people, and there isn't anything to kind of disrupt And I think that's where we can come with kind of complications. I think you'd agree, Paul, where, you know, we get a whole load of information, but there's not that evidence base there. And I think that can be frustrating, if I'm honest, for people who are referring in. And it can be frustrating for us, isn't it, as partners, because we want to be able to disrupt and actually stop the exploitation from happening. So triage happens on a daily basis. We'll go for any relevant forms. I didn't mention PPE, exploitation officers will be in there as well, who deal with CSE. You'll have Paul and his team that deal with the CE. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass on to Paul, and then just so you can just explain the policing perspective, Paul.
Yeah, no problem. So obviously, Karis, you talked a lot there about young people, but obviously we are an all-age exploitation. So if anybody's got issues, concerns for kids or adults, then obviously we discuss those on the screening forms as well. So mine and Sue's job, Sue Rose on the call as well, is predominantly to deal with the disruption. And like Karis has said, the more information, the more detail that's on the exploitation screening form, assessment, should I say, the better. Because without the detail, we can't pursue it, or we can pursue it. But often when myself and Sue pick it up, a lot of the young people or the adults don't want to speak to police. They'd rather speak to somebody like the mental health nurse, or, you know, the social worker, or whoever is out there that's currently working. They'd rather open up to that person. So what we see a lot is that the assessments are filled in sometimes straight away without any professionals working with the young person or the adult. So sometimes they'll be opened up for a CAFA, but they'll put the form in with limited information just on what they've been received from an anonymous source or whoever they've had it from. So the devil is in the detail. So without quickly jumping to it and working, you know, to filling out the assessment, go out and speak to the young person or the adult or the mom or the dad or the nan or the auntie, whatever, to build up that bigger intelligence assessments that we can work with. But then myself and Sue will pick it up. If there's something that we think that somebody will work with us, that they're open to work with professionals, myself and Sue will go out and speak to them. And then from that, we'll go and speak to them, get the detail, ask those probing questions, try and find out who's exploiting them, and then obviously target them, disrupt them, get a statement of complaint, you know, in terms of arresting them then. If they are a victim of modern slavery, then obviously we'll do the necessary in terms of contacting the SCA and filling in the NRMs, so they are then classified as a victim of modern slavery, and then build up that case. Like I say, the more detail, the more evidence that we've got, more we can charge somebody when it comes to CPS. But often it's a lot of, this is what I've been made to do. So we do need evidence, obviously, to charge somebody. So that's what we'll do. And then sometimes we'll hold a disruption meeting, which hasn't happened the last couple of weeks with one thing or another. But we do hold disruption meetings with children's services, adult social care, and a number of other professionals who are working with that young person or adult to say, okay, before we go out and do X, Y, and Z, either speaking to the young person or the adult, let's have a meeting, a broader meeting, probably with the DSL, the education, or whoever, to say, okay, what do we know? And then when we go out, and myself and Sue, we know that we are very clued up on, when we're probing the person, we know X, Y, and Z, which is in our favour when speaking to the person, because sometimes we start saying, well, we know of so and so, we know and so and so. They're like, okay, it's a bit of a weight off their shoulders in some aspect. I think, we do know. Obviously, we don't always tell them everything. Dependent, if there is a case and there is an investigation, we wouldn't tell them everything. But depending on case by case, we would drop certain snippets of information to try and get them to open up. But obviously, we'll gauge that by going out and speaking to them first. If you can hear my dog behind me, she wanted a dinner. So that's mainly myself and Sue's job, is going out and trying to disrupt, get evidence, disrupt, and obviously bring the offenders to justice. Sue, is there anything else that you want to touch on?
No, I think you've covered the majority of it. I am fairly new, so Paul is more experienced than myself. But yeah, generally what he's just said.
I was going to say as well, I think it's probably worth mentioning as well, just the fib form as well at this point, because not everybody would know about it. But there's, for most partners, so whether you're working across NHS, etc., there's a fib form process, and that is a form where if we've got intelligence, and I suppose that's the difference, isn't it, for what you're speaking about, is that there's a big difference between information and intelligence. And I think sometimes we're given a lot of information but not always intelligence. Intelligence is normally where you can identify it to something, it can lead somewhere. So you're not just saying, oh, there's a guy across the park with a clutch bag and he's just walking around and looks suspicious. That would just be a bit of information. Intelligence would be, there's a man approximately 15, 16 across the road, he lives at 6 Mount Road, he associates with Tommy Jones, who is a known drug dealer in the area, who I seen give him this bag. He's now standing on a street corner and went to a black car Astra on 30 Mount Road, handed them a package and then went. So there's a difference between kind of information and intelligence, and I think that's kind of what Paul's saying, is that the more intelligence we can give rather than information, the better, because they can act on it. And if we do have intelligence, there is a route into that, which is via the fib form, and that is where we can put that down, and that will go into the Intelligence Bureau for the police, and that will then sit on police systems and then be disseminated to the relevant teams. And that's really important, because if you give information, for example, if I give information to Paul, that information will only sit with Paul. If I give information via the fib, it sits on the police intelligence system. So it's not that, so it's part of that process that we've got, especially for our internal partners. If we have got information and intelligence, we do need to be putting in those fib forms. I mean, if I can, I might be able to put one in. Can you put documents in the chat? Is that a thing? I think
I'm not sure. We can email it out. Anyway.
I think you can, Carrie.
Say again, sorry.
I think you can.
I'll try and look. Yeah, I mean, we'll try and get it in chat. If not, it can be emailed out. But I suppose it's just worth mentioning that as well, and that can be part of our blocker as well. If it's not sitting on police systems, there can be a delay in kind of actioning that information, where if it just sit on a police system, it's been sanitized, gone through a process, and it's almost like it's valid then. It's like valid intelligence. So those fib forms are very important.
And those fib forms, I'll just carry on from that, Carrie, will then lead on to possible warrants. So, you know, if there's a information, the concern there's a drug dealing den over there, then okay, well, we get 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, this is more than just, you know, a snippet of information. There's a real possibility that there's there's somebody's being cuckooed or there's drug dealing going on from there. That will build it up, and then the neighbourhood teams will then look at it to build that warrant to go to court, to obviously for us then to put the door in at that property. So yeah, the more intel goes in, the better.
Yeah, and I think, and there's Rach as well, who is the exploitation. You've also got the missing officers as well. So I don't know if you guys have kind of said what you do already, but if you want to say more, then I suppose I was looking at the time and thinking, have we got time? Mike, you call it.
Yeah, if you go on, Rich, you've always got something.
There's not a lot to add, really. I don't think from my end, is there? So yeah, I'm one of the missing and exploitation coordinators that works part of the hub. So part of our role is to look at the exploitation tools that come in through the missing inbox, and we would then cascade them out after we've had a look through it, had a look at the information that comes through, clarified with anyone if fibs have been sent in. Again, if they haven't, makes a huge difference in when it's sent in through triage. Yeah, we're available to contact if there are any concerns, if there are any names, areas, locations. We all always encourage people to send that information in through to us, because again, if it is something we are aware of, we can inform the police, again, complete the fib form with it. But yeah, that's the part of our role as the missing and exploitation.
And I didn't start mixing, so it's the occupy said, not sure. I think it's 2 cents, not 5, sorry. So I have a 5 pence or 2 cents, and I've mixed the two together. Emma, did you want to say anything about missing, or we covered it?
Yeah, just as I was saying earlier, so I'll do the return home interviews, and that is mainly information gathering. So as Karis was saying, how important the fibs are, that information that I hold following the return home interviews can be fed back into police or social care and build a bigger picture about what's going on, who they're associating with locations of concern, and see if we can disrupt missing episodes, but also exploitation. Not everyone that goes missing is exploited, but we always say everyone who's been exploited will be gone missing at some point, whether they're reported or not. So that chat that I have with them can help build that picture for police to disrupt or social care to disrupt and safeguard it.
I think that's us. Oh, I suppose. Oh yeah, myself. I suppose. Forgot with violence. Yeah. So I'll do it really quick because I will talk forever. But yeah. So my job is essentially sitting on the police panel, which is the equivalent of triage for violence. However, it's not. It's a new process, so it's still developing. And then just working in either community or with schools to work on that kind of anti-violence kind of prevention work. And I think Mike, you've kind of already explained yourself what me and Mike work a lot together, and we're doing a piece of work centred and focused around coma and porphyry at the minute.
Brilliant. So, yeah, we're a very enthusiastic, gifted team that are passionate about the work that we do, which is really good. So we're gonna refocus now, because as Keris has pointed out, I'm aware of time, but we're just going to refocus and look at young people again and focus back on that. So the main sort of statement speaks for itself, but sometimes it's really important to hear. Child criminal exploitation and child sexual exploitation is child abuse, where children and young people are manipulated and coerced into committing crimes or committing sexual acts. So if I just quickly run through this isn't my idea. I've actually stolen this from someone else. But obviously, what you've got in front of you is an iceberg on the sea. And what this person said was, quite often when we work with young people, as adults do, only show parts of what they want others to see. And there's some things that maybe we're aware of, but the important thing is that there's things that we're not aware of too. And this sort of slide is quite important. So things like, young people receiving gifts that maybe they don't usually have, new pairs of trainers or clothes or jewelry or something like that. Maybe the lifestyle has changed. Maybe, they've gone from coming home at 4 o'clock in an afternoon to staying out later. Maybe how they talk about their own family compared to how they talk to their peers is different. Maybe there's a change in behaviour and attitude at school, at home, when meeting other professionals. Maybe they feel that they're accepted by who they class as their peer group, but maybe not accepted by those people that are close to them, like families. Maybe they talk about carrying weapons. Maybe they talk about being part of a community, but not the community that they live in. Maybe they've played music that has been a bit of a diss track, so where the name names of other people and what they'd like to do with them, basically. But all these are potentially things that we see. And then this isn't a comprehensive list. We can add to this, but then there's things that we don't see, which I think is equally important and kind of flicks between the two. So things about paranoia, looking over the shoulders when they're out and about with you, not wanting to go into certain areas. Maybe they're being blackmailed by the perpetrator. If you don't do this, then this will happen to you. Maybe they use weapons. Maybe they threaten others. Maybe they're threatened themselves. There might be things around them not being able to sleep. And so that then affects how they are during the daytime. Maybe they're forced to rob from shops or steal from people. And there's something about trauma that underpins all this, which is something that at times is quite hard to identify. the reason why I bring this up is twofold. Firstly, this is something that I've actually done with parents of young people. When we first started out talking about maybe their child being a victim of exploitation. So we print off the picture that's in front of you and say, what do we see? And then we name it. And then underneath, what do you think's going on underneath? What do you think's going on in the head and the heart? And we name that just so that we can paint a picture. But it's also important then for parents to actually be able to verbalise and write it down so that they see it themselves. There's times as well when I've done this with young people. So tell us, how do you portray yourself? When you're out and about, what reputation do you have? And sometimes the hardest part is to get them to actually delve deeper into what's going on. But this isn't a quick fix process. This goes on over time and whilst doing other activities as well. My wife said, Mike, it'd also be good for you to do this for yourself. So also from a reflective point of view on my practice about what I show other professionals and what's really going on in here, but that'll never see the light of day. But this is quite a good exercise to do, and also a good way of maybe evidencing how we feel, because sometimes we can't see the impact of exploitation, but our gut says that there's something going on. And so sometimes it's good just to put that down on paper. And I found this quite a creative way of doing it. And any comments or thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just ask what a diss track is.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's when a group of people maybe do a music track to try and get a reaction from another group of people. So usually it's within gangs. You know, they call people out saying, "Oh, we're going to do this," or "We've done that," or "One of your members got shot and stabbed, and it was the best thing that ever happened to him," kind of thing. It's that kind of thing, but in more youthful terms.
Right. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
It's all right. They also do, sometimes they've done videos as well, and this is something else to be aware of. It happened to a young person who was in Birmingham, in that a group of older youths came up to him and said, "Do you want to be in a video? Do you want to be in a music video?" This young person, 11 years old, loved music, said, "Yeah." They said, "Brilliant. We've even got some clothes that you can wear so that you look cool and trendy in it." So he was like, "Yeah, that's good." So they got in the tracksuit and everything like that. It came to the park. There were other young people there. They filmed it. This young lad had no idea what was going on. About 2 weeks later, he's in McDonald's in Birmingham and he's queuing up, waiting to be paid, when 3 older lads come in and say, "Oh, you're so-and-so, you were on that music track." And they basically tip his tray over and they're going to start on him. So this lad is really, really scared. If it hadn't been for his cousin stepping in and saying, "Look, he knew nothing about it," he'd have probably got beaten up. The reason why these 3 lads targeted him was because it were almost like a diss video. The lads that confronted him in McDonald's were the opponents, the opposites, and yeah. So you know, young people like the 5 minutes of fame as well, and sometimes, as innocent as that is, almost, you know, come and be part of a video, and a young person does it because they're a good dancer or whatever, can lead to some serious repercussions. Sometimes professionals aren't aware of that. So the other thing to do if we're working with young people and we might have concerns, or our gut is saying that they're involved in stuff, is maybe look on YouTube. You know, there's some groups within Walsall that are posting videos on YouTube, not necessarily the faces, but music anyway. And it just gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going on. So that's that. If I move on quickly. So So attitudes seen in the work that we do with young people, and the question of how as professionals do we work with young people who displays these attitudes is really difficult. But I think these 5 points sum up some of the attitudes really well. So if we go through it quickly, so condemnation of condemners. Young people feel a sense of unfairness and being picked on for something others have done and not being punished for. And quite often we see that, oh, well, they did it and they got away with it, so why can't I get away with it? You know, that kind of attitude. Denial of injury. So they're justifying their actions. Well, if I hadn't have hit him, he'd have hit me. And I don't want to get injured, so it's best that I injure him first. Or it was just one punch. That's all it was. Denial of the victim. Well, they started first. They looked at me wrong. So I had to do something, or they put something on social media. So I had to respond, and this is how I responded. Denial of responsibility. So blaming another factor. Yeah, well, you know, I'd had a few to drink or smoke, and I was feeling a bit aggy, and then they came over, so they looked at me funny, so I just hit them. Or appeal of higher loyalties. So the young person claims that rule of law had to be ignored because more issues were at stake, such as, you know, well, they took the P out of my faith or my religion or the colour of my skin or the way that I talk or the way that I look. So I had to do something about that to save face. And I don't know if people would agree that maybe some of these are seen in young people that we work with now, sort of these attitudes. And it's really important as professionals working with young people that, one, we can identify where the young person stands in these attitudes. And then two, how do we work with young people that have almost this inbuilt attitude within them? For me, as I work with young people, I do see these come to the forefront quite often. The other thing about not snitching or not telling them on others is a big thing that fits into this. Interestingly enough, this is actually a criminology theory that a guy wrote in 1960 when looking at men that had been put in prison, and he'd done a series of interviews with them about the crime they'd committed, and these were the responses that they were getting. And it's interesting now that in 2022, a lot of the time, young people we talk to have some of these answers themselves. So it's not something new, but it just seems to be a little bit more ingrained in young people that we're working with now, especially young people that are victims of criminal and sexual exploitation. So any thoughts or views or comments on that? Or can we move on?
I have a comment, but I'm going to be really quick because I know that we're running
Yeah.
But I was just going to say that just to kind of like the last two slides that you put up, I think when we were looking earlier, I think people were talking about what were the signs and what I think that was one of the things that was mentioned. And I think what you've said then is clearly the signs, all those things that we kind of see at the top of the iceberg is the signs of a young person. These kind of comments is a sign of a young person who's experiencing potential trauma, and looking at what's underneath that as a professional is really important. So just throwing it, just basically saying that I really like how you've put these two together, Mike, because I think it, as a professional, it gives us perspective as to what we should really be looking at, opposed to what we see, because what we see isn't necessarily what we need to look at a lot of the time. It's about what's going on underneath, and I think once we can target that and we can understand that's where we can really start doing the work. And I think that I'm sure you'd agree, Mike, that's the hardest part of the job, isn't it? I mean, the behaviour and seeing the behaviour and addressing, oh, you've just done this and etc. is the easy part, but the reasons underneath and the why and what's driving it is the hard thing to figure out. And but once we do that, that's where we can start to see that cycle of change come in.
Yeah, definitely. And it's attitudes from young people that maybe we don't understand because we're not young people anymore. And as a 40-year-old, looking back at when I was 15, life was very different back then. For starters, we hadn't had a pandemic at that point or anything. And so sort of looking at sort of the culture and the environment, and also how life has changed over the last sort of 2 years, maybe more, is going to have effect on young people, because it's had an effect on adults too. But we'll come on to that in a little bit. But these aren't necessarily things around conversation. These are just to help us be prompted when we work with young people. So we're going to move on quickly. So the importance of training around awareness, in child sexual exploitation, hotels are used often, and in Walsall, street teams have and had been delivering training to hotel staff around what to look out for. Years ago, there was an issue where a man brought a young girl to a hotel in Walsall, and the hotel refused the man a room. And so then what happened was they went to another hotel 5 minutes down the road, and in that time, the first hotel had phoned the second hotel and said, there's going to be a guy here. This is what he looks like. He's got an underage girl and he's wanting to book a room. So the importance of delivering training to hotels is important. Taxi ranks. So when they renew the license, they do training around CSE. And it's also about observation as well. In the past, wooded areas have had mattresses and drug paraphernalia and other things around and about. Some people would just see that as, maybe fly tipping, but to others, it rings alarm bells, and it's how we report these things. Derelict buildings. Young people love to explore. I did as a young child, but derelict buildings are places where, young people are groomed quite often because it's out of sight, and other areas too. Trains and bus stations, wherever young people congregate, it's important to have a look out for that. Food retail places as well, where young people can come and be, are often places where exploitation begins. In Walsall in the past as well, we've got amazing canals in Walsall that are beautiful for walking on, but they're also out of the way too. That's another area that we need to be aware of. And it's important to understand that often young people are given rewards for doing things. So it isn't just always focused on the violence. And in the past, these have included things like time in a music studio, where they can record that track that they've wanted to do, but maybe couldn't afford to go to a music studio to do it. Rewards such as alcohol, drugs, money, and other incentives too. So all these are things to bear in mind and be aware of. Am I okay to move on? Yay. So I just want to very quickly touch on, so this was a bit of research done by Nottingham University during the pandemic, because they had nothing else better to do. And so what they looked at was how the pandemic has influenced and impacted on young people. And so what they look at is the fact that mental health amongst young people deteriorated. There was a rise in self-harm and also substance misuse. From a youth justice point of view, while breaches of the orders remained low, children could be remaining in dangerous situations, complying with both their statutory orders and also the orders of the perpetrators. So they were using those 30-minute walks to go and be and do the work that they're being asked to do by the perpetrator while still being able to have a conversation with the youth justice worker or whomever via phone or WhatsApp. And that was because of the reduced face-to-face time between professionals and children. And it also meant that it was harder to identify those signs of exploitation too. What's interesting, and I think we're still seeing this in Walsall even now, is that movement away from rail networks towards the roads by county line networks. So during the pandemic, there was an increase in car theft, vehicle-related injuries, ID fraud, so that they could, get a driving license to prove their age and hire rentals, etc. What is interesting, and I think we're still seeing an increase in this, is that county lines related violence has become more severe, with an increase of number of stab wounds and those presenting to A&E with those wounds, and an increase in online grooming and exploitation. It's interesting from a youth work perspective, a lot of our youth work went online during that time, and young people were quite comfortable with that. It was us as adults that didn't like being on the screen. But likewise, that's how people were grooming young people through online networks. So, yeah, if we'd had more time, we'd go through this. But what's interesting about Walsall, like many other towns, is that we're surrounded by other bigger counties, cities, etc. And it's just interesting when we look at this, that we've got Staffordshire up top, Birmingham, sort of more or less all around the right hand side, Sandwell and Wolverhampton, and Walsall isn't an island. Young people through social media having conversations with young people from these towns and cities and meeting up, or young people are coming to Walsall, or Walsall young people are going out as well. And that makes it hard from a friendship point of view, whereas in the past, Beechdale might have been an area, as an example, where young people didn't mix outside of their own community. Now young people are travelling out to mix, and that makes it harder then when we're having conversations with young people, because they might name a name, but it's not a Walsall young person. So then the difficulty then is, as professionals, how we build our relationship up with partners from surrounding areas so that we can share and have a conversation about the risks and share names, etc. So Walsall as a whole is in quite an interesting area in that, Birmingham in the past, reputation around gangs, drug dealings, etc. Sandwell, you've got West Brom up the road. Wolverhampton, exactly the same. Cannock, that kind of nice, leafier area, and then Staffordshire on the other side. So I suppose the point from this slide is that young people are moving out of Walsall. Interesting, you talk to a young person in, let's say, Willenhall, and quite often they will admit to being from Walsall, because they've got a Wolverhampton postcode. Quite often young people say, oh, I'm from Wolves, when really they're not, they're from Walsall itself. And the same with young people from, let's say, Feasey, which borders Birmingham. They won't necessarily claim that they're from Walsall, they'll claim to be from Birmingham as well, sometimes to have that little bit more of a reputation. So that's one of the things to be on the lookout for too. So I suppose as professionals, what we need to do is, when we're working with communities, is understand what's the crime rate and what does that look like in that community. What's the thing that underpins the work that we do? What's the ethnicity of the communities that we're working in areas like Porphyry, Pleck and Karma. When you talk to some of the community leaders in those areas, they would describe their community as a gateway for newly arrived communities, and we kind of see that with maybe Iraqi and Afghan families moving in, as well as Eastern European families moving in. And so communities are changing drastically in Walsall. And as professionals working with young people, we need to understand the change within the dynamics of communities, and we need to alter the way we talk about communities accordingly. So Sharon brought up around Beechdale, and years ago Beechdale would have been classed as a white, maybe working class community, maybe with some far right tendencies. Nowadays Beechdale is changing. There's African families living on Beechdale, there's Polish families living on Beechdale. How does that mix affect the local residents that have been in that area for generations? So what are the issues there? What are the provision for young people, not just local authority, but also do churches or mosques or other places of worship run youth groups that maybe young people can attend? If young people can't attend, then why? Local schools, secondary schools in particular, are young people travelling out of their community to get an education? And if so, what's the impact of that on the young person's life? And also access to public transport too, in relation to travelling out of community. Can they go places? Can they get to school and come back without missing the last bus home? Someone said that, and I found this quite pertinent, county lines does not start at the end location, it starts in their own yard. So the grooming process doesn't start when they reach the trap house or wherever. It actually starts usually in where they are in their community, or what they class as their community. So I'm aware, you know, the last few slides you've been talked at. Any thoughts, questions, or reflections on what you've just heard?
It's
No, Mark.
Yeah, go on.
No, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, it's all really, really, really interesting and very. I'm from Birmingham, and I've just sort of moved over, not to live in Walsall, but to work in Walsall. So I'm getting my head around the different areas and things. So it's also kind of been quite relatable in that aspect. So thank you.
Thank you. Paul, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, thank you, Mike, for presenting it. It was really helpful. Obviously, we always look at often from a different viewpoint, being police officers. So it's good to see and hear, you know, from your viewpoint on things as well, because obviously it's this us when going out and engaging with young people. So thank you for the input.
So just one more slide. We did say at the, well, two more, but the next one's, yeah, neither here nor there. You know, it's about sharing good practice as well, and you know, very much not about ego here. It's about sharing, you know, what we know works with young people. So as in the last sort of 2-3 minutes, has anyone got any examples of good practice of work that you've done with young people that you'd be prepared to share?
I've got one. Mike of a social worker. If nobody else has got one.
Yeah,
I'll
go on.
see if anyone's got one. Oh, and I saw someone. No, okay. I thought I'd share one just about a social worker who was working with a young person. So it was a young person who came up in violent panel. As they came up as a victim of an assault. We kind of discussed them in panel and was like, okay, so we're going to offer Heal Hub, which is some therapeutic support, and also a lived experience mentor to try and help the person. So the social worker kind of went in and it kind of explained like the background for the young person, the different things that were going on with his mental health, schooling, education. and kind of the wealth of things that were going on behind him. And this social worker, for me, what was really good about her practice was the fact that what she did is that she pulled together every aspect in terms of, she sat down, she understood there was a massive mistrust for professionals, and she respected that. The young person was very dubious of any type of mentoring support, etc. And what I observed with her is that she did exactly what you said in terms of the iceberg. So the presenting issues really were mental health, risks around violence, etc. Potential, there was a whole load of things. So this is a case where you've got mental health, exploitation, violence, drugs, all familiar concerns around family, mum's ability to protect. So there was a lot of complexities. But what she did, which I thought was good, is she layered the support. She layered the support and she went at the family's time. So what she did is she said, this is the support that you can have. However, we'll go at your pace. She sat down, she built trust with the family, and she fed in professionals bit by bit at appropriate times. However, she always kept the young person's opinion and what they wanted at the centre of it as well. And what we saw was a family that was very anti-services, very anti-social workers, anti-government institutes, kind of change and soften. And I think for me, her practice has been really good. She's been able to pull all the statutory partners together, police together, health together, and this young person is literally receiving support or in some controls in each area. But it's down, for me, I think it's down to the practice of that social worker, and it's because she did exactly what you said. She looked at what was going on, what were the drivers, and she's targeting the drivers, not the behaviour itself. And it's one of those that you can see the trust is building, which is the main thing in this case. You're not going to get everything just changed because there's so much complexities there, but the fact that that family can now trust their social worker is going to have a significant impact on their engagement for professionals to come.
Thanks for sharing that, Caris. Really appreciate
it. Sounds amazing. Who is she?
She's really good. really good, to be fair.
And I think there's keywords that you use there, building trust. Sometimes we feel that maybe because we wear a coat tag around our neck that we automatically deserve or expect that. But, there's the other side of it as well, that, the families want another adult in their life, almost seem to be dictating. And what that social worker did seems to be very both young person focused and family focused. So yeah, got a lot from that. Thank you. And finally, we have nearly done. In the comments, what I'd like you to do is choose one of the three, and it can be any of them really. What did you find useful? What made you think? Is there anything else you would like to discuss? Having a conversation with our line manager, Katie, she was saying that maybe this is something that we can roll out on a more regular basis, not just during, Exploitation Awareness Week or County Lines Intensification Week. So if you think it's been useful, then that'd be good. What made you think? Was there anything? Have you got any questions? Would you like this to be something that we look at on a fairly regular basis, maybe even face to face rather than online? Would be good at some point. But yeah, there's an option there, I suppose, just to come and discuss and share. And yeah, but thank you all for participating. It's been a really good session. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to meeting all of you in person at some point.
Thank you.